So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. All right, is it? All right. Well, we'll work out it this way. Thank you for coming. Thank you for caring about. Thank you for caring about Canada. Thank you for caring about our history. Thank you for caring about Sir John A. Macdonald. Thanks to Guy and Ron and Beth and others for organizing this event and showing that there is another side for people to reflect upon. So it's a pleasure for me to be here. My only regret is that I could have come here today via the Sir John A. Macdonald Parkway. I didn't take that route. But how many here came to this event using the Sir John A. Macdonald Parkway? Which was, you know, it's quite incredible. Not that long ago, we renamed the Ottawa River Parkway for Sir John A. When it was his 200th birthday, a couple of years ago, Canada Post featured a stamp with Sir John A. Macdonald. We had a Sir John A. Macdonald Bicentennial Commission. For 150 years, we've been celebrating this man that has been, you know, instrumental to the life of Canada. In fact, without Sir John A. Macdonald, I believe there is no Canada. And all of a sudden, in the last few years, he's gone from saint to sinner. Historians for the past 100-odd years have been writing about this man as the greatest Canadian of all time, and now all of a sudden, he's not only in the sin bin, he's in a place that's worse than that. And I find this quite astonishing, because when you think of it, Canada really is an improbable country. On paper, it makes no sense that we exist. When you consider our cultural, linguistic, social, economic, geographic diversity, how is it that we've managed to assemble a country that goes from one ocean to another, that has one of the largest land masses of any country in the world, yet we've managed to maintain our cohesiveness? We built a great country. And it's because of people that have come along at various points in our history and provided inspired leadership. And no one has provided more important and inspiring leadership than Sir John A. Macdonald. In fact, in my quest, John Robson is a great historian, and I've come into this, you know, over the last 20 years or so. He's got more time as a historian, but, you know, and I really started to study the history of Canada. I thought I would look at every conservative leader from Sir John Macdonald right up to Stephen Harper, and look at their contributions to Canada, the struggles that they faced, the issues that they overcame, the vision that they gave for Canada. And I came to the conclusion that there is no one who can come even close to Sir John A. Macdonald in terms of his contribution to Canada. Now, how is it that he went from saint down to sinner? How is it that now even the city of Kingston has struck a commission to study how they are going to deal with the legacy of Sir John A. Macdonald? The Canadian Historical Association wants to take his name off of their annual literary prize. The Elementary Teachers Federation wants to have his name stripped from our schools. And then, of course, Victoria, as Ron has mentioned, has already removed his statue. Now, you'd mentioned, Ron, that this was following, I think you called it extensive research that was done. You know, what I found interesting when I tried to delve into, well, what extensive research that they did, you know, I discovered in their press release that they didn't even spell Macdonald's name correctly. Now, how extensive can you get when that's when you are? So how is it that he went from saint to sinner? Well, I trace it back to a book that was written by James Dashuk called Clearing the Plains. And it was an examination of the issues that Indigenous peoples faced on the prairies in the late 1800s, and there was starvation. And they attributed, well, there was a quote from Macdonald that they took out. And in fact, this entire book has 2 quotes from Macdonald, only 2. And one of the quotes, and I'll read it to you here. This is Macdonald in the House of Commons. He said, We cannot allow them, this is speaking of Indigenous people, to die for want of food. We are doing all we can by refusing food until the Indians are on the verge of starvation to reduce the expense. Now that's a pretty harsh quote. We're waiting till they're on the verge of starvation to reduce the expense. Now, it is disturbing, but it's also incomplete. You have to think, well, what caused Macdonald to say such a thing? I mean, was he cold-hearted? Was he oppressive? The question that he was answering came from Liberal MP David Mills, who later served as Justice Minister in the Laurier government and then later on the Supreme Court of Canada. His question was, a barbarous population like the Indians may very easily be made wholly dependent upon the government to the extent that it will be very difficult to induce the Indians to devote themselves to industrial pursuits. What he was saying was, if we feed them and clothe them and house them, they will lose their independence and their sense of purpose. Now, he didn't quite say it as eloquently as that. It was more pointed than that. And in response, Macdonald said, opposed this quotation to say that in the case of apprehended famine, this is not a quote that was in the Dastrick book, but in the case of apprehended famine, the matter is to be dealt with on the spot. When the Indians have been starving, they have been helped. Macdonald was not a man with cruel or evil intent. He didn't want to oppress anyone. He had a vision for Canada. And the vision was essentially that we not become Americans. And in order for us not to become Americans, we had to grow and expand in the colonies that Canada had to combine, Upper and Lower Canada, and New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and eventually the others. And so to do that, Canada needed to grow. And we needed immigration, and we needed land, and we needed a railway, and that did change effectively a way of life for Indigenous peoples. And Macdonald was not insensitive and uncaring towards them. When he was being criticized for providing help to Indigenous peoples, and he is providing that help in a country that was decidedly racist. Canada was a racist country, up and down, through all political parties, all parts of society were that way. And it's difficult to excuse, but just think of what did the European settlers encounter when they arrived here? They were the settlers who come from countries that had built castles and that had established rule of law and Magna Carta and Petition of Rights and Bill of Rights. They had music with Bach and Beethoven. They had built these, Rome had been built in such incredible ways. They had architectural, they had engineering, they had industry. And when they arrived here, they encountered the Indigenous populations that were living in conditions that they considered to be quite inferior. Their intention was to help, to say that your way of life is obviously very arduous and very difficult. Their belief was our society had advanced to a certain degree and that they were going to try to be of some assistance. Now, I'm not saying that their policies were correct and always appropriate. Some of them were misguided, some of them did not work, but it wasn't because, at least in Macdonald's case, because he had ill intent and because he was cruel. So as he was criticized by others in this racist society, what did he say? He said, we must remember that they, this is speaking of Indigenous peoples, are the original owners of the soil, of which they have been dispossessed by the covetous or ambition of our ancestors. The Indians have been great sufferers by the discovery of America and the transfer of it to a large white population. Now, does that strike you as someone who is unsympathetic and evil and cruel, or someone who, in fact, who was trying to be helpful? In fact, when you look at the plight of Indigenous peoples in North America, they used to have this thing called the medicine line. The medicine line was essentially the Canadian-US border. And Indigenous peoples that were in America would cross the border, come into Canada because of the way they were treated. In America, the expression was, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. That's not what Macdonald's view was. Theodore Roosevelt, who later on went to become president, said, I think that quote about the only good Indian is a dead Indian is a bit of an exaggeration. In my case, I think it should only be 9 out of 10. So you can see Macdonald does distinguish himself quite a bit. In fact, Macdonald had the temerity at the time to suggest that the vote, the franchise, should be granted to Indigenous peoples. That was quite an unexpected offering. To that, the Liberal MP in the House of Commons said it would be like bringing a scalping party to the poll. Another said it was an insult to place the white brethren on a level with pagan and barbarian Indians. The Liberals at the time did not want the native Indigenous peoples to get the vote because their view was they would all end up voting for Macdonald. The man that the Indigenous people are now vilifying was really one of their great defenders. Now, the other issue that comes up is the residential school crisis. Now, this was a case where the government of Canada, the taxpayers of Canada at the time, were trying to, their intent, to improve the living conditions, the education, the sophistication, the civilization of Indigenous peoples, and they thought that the appropriate policy was to put them into residential schools. And in these residential schools, Macdonald, they existed before Macdonald was Prime Minister, but they did expand under Macdonald. 3 schools were added, and there were some issues in the residential schools, not issues of bad intent necessarily, but of bad management and some abuse. But Macdonald, in fact, was acting on the recommendations of the experts at the time, that this was the appropriate thing to do. Now, if this began and ended with Macdonald, and he was the leader of the residential school conversion, it was his idea, he could be rightly criticized for it. But the fact of the matter was, there were 18 prime ministers after, say, John A. Macdonald before the last residential school was closed. There was, for the 40 years after Macdonald, the number of people in residential schools, in fact, increased quite dramatically over the time that Macdonald was there. So it's quite I think, unfair to scapegoat Macdonald for the problems of the residential schools. I mean, the last Prime Minister who was in place when there was a residential school was Pierre Trudeau. He was Prime Minister when there was a residential school. So, you know, I find this quite disturbing that we are, and in fact, when Guy had mentioned that the title for this talk was Hands Off Our History, I said, Guy, it should actually be Hands On Our History. We should be looking at who our heroes were, who the leaders were, who was taking Canada in the right direction, and who was on the wrong side of history. And the research that I've done, the exploration that I have done, have led me to one conclusion, that Macdonald was a great hero. And he should be celebrated, not just by those of us who are here today, but even Indigenous people should look at what his faults were and what his contributions were. And I think if you look at on balance, he will be judged as one of the greatest prime ministers and the greatest contributors to the evolution of our society in Canada of any prime minister possible. Now, let me just conclude with this one note. There are no saints in history. Everyone has their faults, has their mistakes, has issues that might be judged by subsequent generations to have been wrong or inappropriate. How will you and I be judged 50 years from now? How will the current government be judged 50 years from now? How will Justin Trudeau be judged 50 years from now? Will they say, well, he was Prime Minister when there was an epidemic level of suicide on Aboriginal reserves, where there was there was not appropriate and drinkable water on Aboriginal reserves. That is today. Do you not think that our efforts should be focused on trying to resolve the problems of today and create a better society for tomorrow than to spend our time looking back at 150 years and second-guessing and looking as as a scapegoat, tearing down our history? I mean, if you want to start, I mean, maybe we should rename the city of Ottawa. Maybe Victoria should not have been looking at tearing down Sir John A. Macdonald's statue. Maybe they should have been changing the name of Victoria, because, I mean, the British Empire, of course, was highly oppressive with all these colonies and the strife. Maybe they should change the name British Columbia. I mean, where does it stop? I think Sir John A. Macdonald is as relevant today as he was 150 years ago. That the problems that he faced, the solutions that he proposed, how he reconciled the different elements of Canada, be it emerging Canada from just a struggling colony, bringing together English and French, bringing Atlantic provinces into a common confederation. He'd be judged for the contributions that he made in his day. And what we're suffering from now is, I call it a disease, it's called presentism. And we look at everything that happened. We don't have to go back 10 years or 20 years or 30 years to find out where mistakes have been made, where things have not gone according to plan. I mean, look at Canadian history. Look at Laurier in the Chinese head tax, how he raised it. Look at the internment of people of Japanese and German ancestries during World War I and World War II. We can acknowledge that there was some of these policies that were implemented were perhaps misguided, perhaps ineffective, perhaps oppressive. I mean, where is there a greater abrogation of jurisprudence, of habeas corpus, of the rule of law than the War Measures Act that was implemented by Pierre Trudeau? Does that stop us from naming schools after him? Of course, I wouldn't be in favor of that, but so I'm so happy that the energy that's here today is in support of our heroes, and is in support of Canada and our love of Canada. And I think that I'm gladly, when I leave here today, I will gladly take the Sir John A. Macdonald Parkway towards downtown, and let's make sure it stays that way. Thanks very much.